It's good to see you today. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We're going to be, chapter 9. We're going to be looking at verses 3 through 15 today. So let's get over there and let's read some together. Verse 3. This is where we left off yesterday. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not eat of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Verse 10. Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt. This is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things, that it should be done so to me, for it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. A little bit lengthier reading today, so I appreciate you in enduring the word, bearing with the word of exhortation as it is. What we're going to be thinking about today, we are going to be thinking about rights. And we're going to see, because that's the context. We're talking about liberties still. We're talking about liberties, we're talking about rights, and Paul is setting himself up as a pattern. And he's going to be talking about there in verse 4. Let me throw it back up there. Verse 4, he uses the phrase, if I can get it working, do we have no right to eat and drink? But he very quickly, and I wonder if that idea of eating and drinking, if he's not using that almost as a metaphor for what comes after this. Partaking of. Chapter 8 was extensively about eating and drinking, eating meat sacrificed to idols, eating in an idol's temple. But I think here, do we have no right to eat and drink? He's not talking about eating and drinking in an idol's temple. He's not saying, do we have no right to go to an idol's temple and eat and drink? That's not his point, and I won't rehash what we talked about last week. Other than to say this, he's not saying we should have fellowship with demons. But anyway, he goes on and he talks about taking along a believing wife. Paul was single. Looks like Barnabas was single as well. Chapter 7, remember, he refers to, in chapter 7, he refers to principles of marriage. And given the current distress, he told them what they should be doing. But anyway, that chapter 7 is all about marriage. So now he's almost back to that topic, but it's within the bigger scope of rights. But he starts off by talking about eat, drink, then it's, do we not have a right to take along a believing wife? But then it goes to preachers being supported, and that idea of churches supporting preachers, and that concept. That's what he's talking about. Preachers living as, and let me get over there to use a phrase. Oh, let's see. Verse 11 just puts it black and white. If we have sown spiritual things, as it says, if we have sown spiritual things, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? But anyway, yeah, there in verse 14, even so the Lord has commanded those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. He's talking about churches supporting preachers, and he's showing that it's authorized. But he's showing actually this idea is rights. Now he's gonna defend. He's defending, but at the same time, he's showing them how they need to be thinking. Okay, I'm blabbering on too much. Pardon me. Okay. First off, he says, and let me look there in verse 5. Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles? One of the things there, he says, do we not have a right to take along a believing wife? So therefore, one of the accusations, or one of the things, and we know one of the things that's going to be taught in the apostasy is the idea of celibacy, and that perhaps ministers of the gospel should not have a believing wife. Paul had made this choice, but he's using himself as an example, and we'll talk more about the example part tomorrow, but he's saying we have this right. Are there those in Corinth saying they don't have the right? No. He's just laying this out. He's saying we have this right, but he says the other apostles are able to do this. This is just the argument. Is it only me and Barnabas who have no right to refrain from working? Is it only me and Barnabas who have no right to do this? But then he goes to the world. Whoever goes to war at his own expense. And I understand he's dealing with different topics, but the overall topic is rights. So he's saying the other apostles have exercised this right. Verse 7, whoever goes to war at his own expense. Let me get the verse up there so you can see it. Whoever goes to war at his own expense. So we've gone from the apostles have exercised this right. It says the world. Listen to the world here. Who goes to war? Who funds? Do the soldiers fund the war? No, it's whoever goes to war at his own expense. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Even the world understands this. Even the world understands this. Okay, so it's the apostles earlier. Verse 7, it's the world. Verse 8, he says, does not the law say the same thing also? So if there are any Jews who were thinking these things, saying the law says this too. The old law says this too. Then he goes to verse, and he kind of, everything's dovetailing together. Notice verse 12. If others are partakers of this right, so it's other apostles, then it's the world, and then it's the law, and then it's you're supporting these other people, but you're saying something about the apostles, about Paul. If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Notice that word right there. Partakers of this right. Then notice verse 13, he comes back to the those who minister the holy things in the temple, so he's back to the Old Testament again. But then verse 14, even so the Lord has commanded, so now we're in the New Testament. Now we're not talking about the world. Now we're talking about this is what the Lord has commanded, that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. Okay, so our points are concerning rights. He says, other apostles do this. Do we not have the right to do it? The world does this. Don't you understand that? The law commanded this. In the old law, it was commanded that those who minister in the temple should eat of these things. They had this right. There were others there in Corinth who they were supporting, and yet they were saying these nefarious things about Paul while they're supporting other people there apparently at Corinth. And then he says, the Lord has commanded this, that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. Now, the whole thing is about rights. The whole thing is about liberties. So here's the point. Paul is saying, just look how strong the argument is. Do they have the authority to do these things? Other apostles do it. You understand it in the world. The old law commanded it. You had others there in Corinth who were being supported this way. And Jesus has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. And then Paul says, but I have used none of these things. That's the point. He says, how much of a right do we have? How much of a right do we have to do these things? We have every right. Whether you're looking at the old law, the new law, the world, or any way else, we have this right, and we are not exercising it. And that is the point of liberties. They are denying themselves. Paul is denying himself. That's the point. He's laying out the argument about just how strongly his rights are founded. That's not the right word, but he's laying out the argument of just how strong his rights are authorized, I guess you would say. But he's saying, we're not using it. I'm not using it. I am denying myself. I have used, verse 15, but I have used none of these things. I've used none of these things. Even though he could have, he didn't. And that's the point of liberties. That's the point of rights. The Corinthians needed to understand they may have the right to do certain things. Certain things may have been lawful in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in the world, whatever the case may be. Just because you have the right to do something does not mean you should do something or that you have to do something. All things are lawful, but all things are not helpful, and they needed to be thinking about others. Here in this country, and I'm sure in other countries, we get all up in arms about our rights. And we must exercise our rights. We need to understand what it means to be a Christian. We don't have to exercise our rights. We can deny what we have a right to. And what we have a right to do, we can deny ourselves if it is helpful for others. Might be helpful for us too, as well. So, yep, Paul had rights, but hope this study's been helpful for you. Appreciate you tuning in. Hope you have a good day. Hope to see you tomorrow for another brief look into God's Word.